Hello, folks. This lecture is on the Progressive Era. Where do we start? Well, some folks start with the election of 1896. Henry Adams was a historian in the 19th century, an observer, one who commented on things, an editorialist. He said for about 100 years Americans vacillated between socialism and capitalism, eventually settling on capitalism, as well as urban industrial values, in which both parties would wholeheartedly endorse. During the McKinley administration, he raised protective tariffs and inflation went up. As a result, new gold brought into the economy, and, well, rather than what the People's Party was hoping for, the greenbacks or the silver. In 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, so that put to rest the free silver issue once and for all. The Spanish-American War diverted people's attention away from domestic issues, as wars tend to do. Many of the ideas that the People's Party had, the direct election of senators, a lot of those things will inevitably be adopted by the progressives. So when was the progressive or impulse era? It really wasn't a movement. Movement sounds like an organized thing which started at a certain date, ended, and people got together and held meetings. I don't know. Maybe 1900 until the end of World War I. Until something happens and we create Fortress America. It's not really so much a movement as it is a collection of reform impulses. There were too many divisions in progressivism to call it a movement. Like many other reformers, the progressives feared for the future of American democracy, American capitalism, American society. Individualism, freedom from restraint and government intervention, free to pursue one's own self-interest. Those were the traditional American values that a lot of reformers felt were going to go to the wayside. So, what would Americans do to adopt this perceived change? The perceived change was, we're overcrowding, we are moving into cities, we have millions of immigrants that are potentially changing what it means to be an American. Land is limited, huge corporations are taking over, the railroads own most of the land out west. And the idea that opportunity is limitless doesn't exist anymore. One thing to know about the progressives is that they firmly believed in the centrality of capitalism. Capitalism was from which the model that reformers would work. Capitalism was here to stay, and it needed to be regulated, not done away with. Its excesses need to be controlled. Capitalism is a growing historical force, and Americans just needed to embrace it. That's what people in the late 1890s and early 20th century believed. And so that's one of the defining characteristics of the progressives. Government action needed to regulate big business. Government was an essential part of ensuring that big business does not damage the economy or trample the rights of individuals. Contrast that with Sumner's hands-off argument. There's nothing you can do about it. In fact, a lot of people believe there's nothing you can do about the economy. It just gets better, it just gets worse. We don't know why. It's like magic. And of course, social reformers would necessarily be arguing that they are trying to redefine what they mean by American democracy. Progressives were not monolithic. Not all agreed on one reform. There was no such thing as the progressive platform, just a number of various reforms. Certainly there were strong conservative elements which resisted reform after 1900. A lot of conservatives argued that weak government was the best government. Conservatives denied the reality of class conflict. Conservatives were inherently loyal to the two-party system. The two-party system tended to support the idea that states should have more power than the federal government. So it's interesting that at the beginning of the progressive movement, these two ideas, one, the belief that the progressives will believe that government is essential at reining in big business, at protecting the American people from business excesses, and you have the conservatives who argue that federal government is bad. And certainly we see those two ideas in the Democratic and Republican Party today. Many in the Republican Party don't even call themselves Republican. They call themselves conservatives. And once we get there, you'll see that there's been about a 20-year history of Republicans trying to do away with so much success of the progressive era, of the work that President Lyndon Baines Johnson did in the 60s and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s. Progressives, for the most part, saw that industrialization was here to stay. 2, problems exist. 3, government needed reform to address the problems of capitalism. A lot of these reformers came from an evangelical background and had a degree or studied the social sciences, history, and government. And of course, the social sciences is a lot about the past, and past typically is about how we messed up. You know, it's not all stories of sunshine and rainbow and puppy dogs and unicorns. History is messy. History is full of racism and bigotry and sexism and brutality, i.e. problems exist. Well, there are a couple ways that progressives saw that they would deal with reform. Reform from within and reform from without. Reform from within would mean people would take the reign and force change. Bottom-up approach. Reform from without, this would be top-heavy. This would be the president. This would be Congress. This would be a government institution telling business how they're going to change. Many progressives used religious language in their arguments, the social gospel. The social gospel said that churches should aid the poor and the downtrodden, to uplift those that were harmed by industrial excesses. Which is a direct contrast with social Darwinism. Well, some of these people involved in the social gospel movement established the Federal Council of Churches in 1908. And the Federal Council of Churches condemned the exploitative nature of capitalism and supported workers' rights to unionize. So there's definitely a link between progressives and evangelical Protestantism. There is no conflict in most progressives' minds between religion and science. They supported science, they supported math. Religion is something that you would do on Sundays if you do that on Sundays. But science is Science explains the world. Science explains the universe. Angels do not move clouds around. Clouds move based on trade winds. The universe is ordered. There are laws to the universe. It's not magic. It's not superstition. Well, many progressives, like Frank Warren, said that humans can intervene in society. It's a natural thing to intervene. They're very pragmatic. People should intervene, and it does not fly in the face of evolution. In fact, Dewey helped establish a movement at this time called pragmatism. Pragmatism was the value of ideas laid in their practical consequences. Regarding economic change, progressives demanded statistics, data. If nothing else, the progressives were invertebrate information gatherers. So, progressives accepted the notion of government intervention. They weren't necessarily in favor of it, but most people believed that was a necessary evil. Of course, there are different types of progressive. One primarily focused on curbing the excesses of capitalism. That would be done through enacting legislation. But that means legislation that would go against the robber barons, the industrial tycoons that ran this country during the Gilded Age. And industrialists would thus have to accept progressives. Some historians argue that the nature of capitalism changed from competitive in the 19th century to corporate in the 20th century. 19th century is one business owner versus another. In the 20th century, we have stockholders, boards of directors, and larger banks. Today we call them too big to fail. Due in part to the merger mentality between the 1890s and early 20th century, many small companies simply vanished or were absorbed by larger and larger companies. In fact, the Supreme Court decided that the 14th Amendment favored corporations over individuals. And capitalism was a way of life and a way of organizing society, class relations, hierarchy, etc. So laws, progressives believed laws had to be adapted and changed to meet the reality of their time, the excesses of corporations. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was this country's first progressive president. Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. He was vice president. He became president in 1901 when his boss, McKinley, was shot and killed in Buffalo, New York. Now, what was Teddy Roosevelt? He was an aristocrat. He was privileged. He graduated from Harvard, elected to the New York State Legislature. Roosevelt is one of the most well-known, well-established, wealthiest families in this country. Roosevelts could trace their entrance into this country to the Mayflower. Well, in 1884, his mother and his wife died within a few hours of each other. And he was absolutely devastated. So he handed his baby daughter off to a family member and just disappeared out west. And it was out west that he decided to seek answers to his troubles, and that was the promotion of strenuous life. The strenuous life, as he called it, was the manly life. Real men would not be sickly. And Teddy Roosevelt worked hard to overcome his youthful illness. He had all sorts of problems. Asthma, vision. years later, in 1886, he returned to New York and re-entered politics. In 1897, he was appointed to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he left the position of government to fight in the Spanish-American War. He was allowed to join a group called the Rough Riders, and he made fun of all those government workers that didn't do the same thing as he did. He called them, quote, unmanly. Fighting and dying in Cuba were manly endeavors. Well, in 1898, the New York GOP machine looked for a man to run as governor, someone they could control. And Teddy Roosevelt looked pretty good after the Spanish-American War. And during the campaign, he mentioned reform, but mainly waved the banner of military victory, waving the bloody shirt, what they used to say during the Civil War. So he supported some civil service reform. He raised taxes against, this is as governor, he raised taxes against corporations, refused to be manipulated by Platt and the rest of the New York's government machine. And so Platt sought to get rid of TR by banking TR for McKinley's vice president position to make him disappear. See, the position of vice president was where you would go to end your political career. Vice president didn't do too much. They hung around and waiting for the president to die. If that didn't happen, their position is very ceremonial. They go to funerals, they go to weddings, they go to ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Some saw Roosevelt as a hypocrite. Adams said TR was just, quote, pure act. Others saw him as brutal and violent, and others saw him as too ambitious and arrogant. Well, work hard, fight, and breed comes from Napoleon. Some Americans said that could have been Teddy Roosevelt's motto. Well, he talks about being the boy hunter when he was younger. He grows up to be the hunter scholar. He did do a lot of writing, a lot of history. Did go to church, but not very too often, and didn't embrace the religious life in public. He certainly was fearful of what they called race suicide, white women having fewer babies. The trend needed to be reversed, so, quote, good people would continue to be in control of American society. Certainly did not believe in social Darwinism, because he himself noted that he was successful in uplifting or assisting himself, and certainly as governor he did the same thing with immigrants, and noted that other progressives did the same. Although he will believe in the traditional role of women, that of housewife and mother to many healthy children. Well, as president, he was conservative in his words, but willing to reform the system as he saw it. But a lot of the established politicians, both Republican and Democrat, initially did not want to work with Roosevelt. Remember, vice president position was a place where you go to die politically, not waiting until you could become president. Well, he slowly won over the members of his cabinet. He only got rid of 2. And one of the issues was the trust question. Old laws and customs were no longer sufficient in business. And he called for the national supervision of business, equalize the railroad rates. And thus he was hinting that change is coming. Teddy Roosevelt was really the first president to react broadly to the changing political scene, which resulted in the expansion of the federal government, which resulted in the expansion of federal powers. Roosevelt borrowed a term from a pessimistic book and used it rather derogatory to refer to people who pointed out problems in American society. He called them muckrakers. An example of a muckraker was Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was a reporter for McClure's magazine. And what these muckrakers did, how journalism was changing in the Progressive era, is that reporters stopped being the best friends of business and started to dig a little deeper. Trust, but verify. And so Ida Tarbell did some investigation into Standard Oil. The Rockefeller family had repeated the mantra that they are wealthy because they worked hard and because God wanted them to be wealthy. She looked into that, and she found that really neither hard work nor a deity had really anything to do with it. What was going on is brutality. Rockefeller family would send some hired goons to see if they could talk a competitor into selling. When he couldn't, they'd break some chairs, break some tables, threaten them, maybe break an arm, maybe burn his business to the ground. Not really hard work, and certainly not one that would suggest was supported by a god. Well, McClure's was very important at muckraking in general. They published articles on the milk problem, impure milk. Milk harbored diseases brought death. And they described how germs got into milk. Workers' spit, scar tissue from animals. Remember, the processing of meat and the milking of cows would happen in the same facility, in the same giant room. And so there was a proposition for the inspection of cows, a board of health, and even the question of pasteurization. There was the liquor problem as well. And McClure's magazine used numbers to prove that people drank too much. Now, they were against prohibition, in large part because the industry was just way too large, too many jobs, too important in our economy. But through McClure's, reporters proposed a controlling agency to put profit into non-alcoholic ventures. Well, Tarbell was famous for her expose on the Standard Oil and the big family of the time. And it wasn't just Ida Tarbell, and it wasn't just McClure's magazines. And this is just an example of what was going on broadly throughout the United States. Well, there was this push to regulate business. In 1887, Congress passed the ICC, the Interstate Commerce. This was during Cleveland's administration. Rebates were the number one abuse at the time, and so the ICC dealt with that. Rebates would be a railroad would charge you an amount based on the weight of your product and how far your product would have to be transferred. But if you were a big corporation sending a lot of product, they give you a rebate. They would kick back some to you. So an individual farmer would not get a rebate. Large industries would. So the ICC was passed in part to bring that practice to an end. The ICC established an investigative and a prosecutorial arm that's specifically focused on railroads. They worked to make railroad rates, quote, reasonable and just. Railroads could no longer charge more for different products. There had to be the same rate between markets. Well, the ICC was vague, and the Supreme Court used the rule of reasonableness to favor business. A rule of ICC didn't really do too much. So, as long as these monopolies did not restrain competition, quote, unreasonably, and thus did not hurt the public interest, monopolies were fine. Well, in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, specifically to go after the Rockefellers. Trusts were declared illegal. And theoretically, they're outlawed, monopolies and restraints of trade. But the two big questions, was it okay to restrain trade? And does Congress have the power to regulate or restrain trade? Well, in 1895, the Supreme Court held that the Sherman Antitrust Act did not apply to various business settings, like the refining business, oil, or sugar. President Taft would eventually conclude that combines were illegal regardless of their reasonableness. Teddy Roosevelt not really interested in getting rid of all sorts of trusts. He sees some trusts as beneficial if the collection of businesses provide a good product at a reasonable price. And by the way, what we call monopolies, they simply call trusts. One example of Teddy Roosevelt's activities was Northern Securities. In 1902, Teddy Roosevelt ordered his Attorney General to move against Northern Securities. Northern Securities was a holding company, which was formed by Morgan, Hill, and other, robber barons, to control the Northern Pacific Railroad. But Teddy Roosevelt said he wasn't against all trusts or monopolies, just bad ones. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act was not limited to reasonableness of trade, but any restriction of trade. And so Roosevelt got the Northern Securities Holding Company dissolved. And we have the anthracite coal strike in 1902. About 50,000 miners walked off their jobs in Pennsylvania. This was in May. The miners wanted recognition of their union, they wanted more money, and they wanted better hours. The coalfield owners were also railroad owners, like a guy named Reading. Closed the mines, refused to talk to miners, but by fall, people's coal bins were no longer full. People's coal bins should be full by Labor Day in preparation for winter. They were not. And so people start complaining to the president to do something. Roosevelt decides to intervene, and he called the head of the railroad and the head of the union to Washington, D.C. to have a little talk. Now, Roosevelt may have stepped out of his authority, but that's what Roosevelt does. Here's what he does. He tells the business owner that you will give miners a raise, and if he doesn't, then he's going to send in the military to mine the coal, at which point the coal will belong to the federal government. Two, he tells the union to take the slight wage and be happy with it, or if not, he's going to send in the army to mine the coal. So, federal troops had been employed on the side of owners throughout the 19th century. So, miners will get, in this case, a 10% pay raise, fewer hours, but no recognition of union. And Teddy Roosevelt did support the idea of people being able to pool the resources, but not to hurt the public interest. We have the Hepburn Bill. The Hepburn Bill was passed to amend the Sherman Antitrust Act, so only unreasonable restraints would be illegal. Also part of the Hepburn Bill is that the federal government offered licenses to companies, but licenses were voluntary. The federal government could not intervene in strikes and unions. Roosevelt liked the bill, but it was never passed.